It's just going to be people from the office, Dad. Clients, executives. It'll be boring for you. You wouldn't know anybody there. That's what my son Eric told me on the phone 11 days before his promotion party, in the same easy, dismissive tone he might have used to tell me a movie wasn't really my kind of thing. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone and said, "Sure, son. I understand. And I meant it, mostly, the way you mean things you've decided not to fight about anymore, because fighting costs more than it's worth." What I didn't tell him was that I knew his new boss. I'd known Richard Palmer for 32 years. I just hadn't seen him in 11. My name is Thomas Reyes. I'm 70 years old, a retired aerospace propulsion engineer, 34 years at Holloway Dynamics before I retired. The last 9 of them as director of engineering for the division that built guidance systems for 3 generations of commercial and military aircraft. Richard Palmer had been a junior engineer under me for the first 6 years I knew him, before he left for the business side of the industry and eventually climbed his way up to running divisions instead of designing them. We'd stayed in touch, sporadically, the way old colleagues do. A Christmas card some years, a phone call when one of us changed jobs, an email when the other's name showed up in a trade publication. I hadn't heard from Richard in about 2 years when Eric mentioned, a few months back, that he'd taken a new position at a firm called Aldridge Systems, doing operations management. I hadn't put it together right away that Aldridge Systems was the same company Richard Palmer had become CEO of 18 months earlier. It was Eric himself who eventually mentioned his new boss's name, in passing, during a phone call about something else entirely, and I felt the particular jolt of recognizing a small world getting smaller. I didn't say anything about it, partly because Eric and I had drifted, in the particular way fathers and grown sons sometimes drift, not through any single fight, but through a slow accumulation of missed calls and shortened visits, and a kind of quiet impatience Eric had developed with me somewhere in his 30s that I'd never fully understood the source of. Partly because I'd learned, over the years, that mentioning connections to my son tended to feel, to him, like I was trying to insert myself into his accomplishments, and I'd stopped wanting to give him that impression. So when he called to tell me about the party, his promotion to regional operations director, a real step up, the kind of job that comes with a title on a door in a corner of the parking garage, and told me it would be boring for me, that I wouldn't know anybody, I let it go. I said congratulations. I meant that too. I've never once, in all my frustrations with Eric, stopped being proud of him. But I'd be lying if I said the phone call didn't sit in my chest for the rest of that evening. In the particular way disappointment settles when you've had enough practice recognizing its shape. My wife Carol had passed 4 years earlier. Heart failure, sudden, the kind of loss that doesn't give you time to prepare a single sentence for it. And Eric was the only family I had left close enough to see regularly. Our daughter Beth lived in Seattle, 3 time zones and a full continent away, present mostly through video calls and holiday visits. Eric lived 20 minutes from me. That proximity, I'd always believed, meant something. Lately, it had started to feel more like an accident of geography than an actual closeness. The drift had started, if I'm honest with myself, around the time Eric married his wife Catherine. Catherine was ambitious, sharp, image-conscious in a way that wasn't unkind exactly, but that treated every social gathering as an opportunity for careful curation. I noticed, over the years, that I'd started getting invited to fewer of Eric's work events, fewer of Catherine's family gatherings with her own parents, fewer of the dinners where new colleagues or new neighbors might form their first impression of the Reyes family. I'd asked Eric about it once, gently, over coffee about a year earlier. Am I imagining things, or do I get left off the guest list more than I used to? He'd looked uncomfortable. It's not like that, Dad. Catherine just likes to keep things streamlined. Smaller groups. It's not personal. I let that answer sit for longer than it deserved to sit. I told myself streamlined was a reasonable preference for a woman who liked things orderly. I told myself it wasn't personal, the way people tell themselves things to avoid the harder conversation underneath. The promotion party, though, felt different, and I couldn't quite explain why until I sat with it a few days. Maybe it was the specificity of the excuse. You wouldn't know anybody there. As if 34 years in the same industry, in the same city, meant nothing. As if I were a stranger who'd wandered in off the street rather than a man who'd spent his career shaking hands with exactly the kind of executives who'd be filling that room. I decided not to make an issue of it. I've never been a man who forces his way into rooms he hasn't been invited to. My father, who spent 40 years as a machinist and never once complained about being overlooked for a promotion he deserved, used to tell me that a man's dignity isn't measured by how loudly he demands a seat, but by how steadily he carries himself when the seat isn't offered. I believed that for most of my life. I still mostly believe it. But dignity, held too quietly for too long, has a way of curdling into something closer to invisibility, and I'd started to wonder, in the weeks leading up to that party, whether I'd let that happen to myself without quite noticing. The party was scheduled for a Friday evening at a downtown event space, the kind of glass-walled venue companies rent when they want a promotion to feel like an occasion rather than a memo. I wasn't invited as established, and I spent that Friday evening quietly, alone, eating dinner at my kitchen table, telling myself it didn't matter, mostly succeeding, occasionally failing. Around 9 p.m., my phone rang. Richard Palmer. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was an old colleague courtesy call, the kind that happens once a year and lasts 4 minutes. I answered anyway. Thomas, Richard said, and I could hear noise behind him. A party, glasses clinking, the particular hum of a room full of people trying to impress each other. You will not believe the conversation I just had. Try me. I'm at a promotion party for one of my regional directors. Good kid, sharp, hard worker. Eric Reyes. He paused, and I could hear him moving somewhere quieter, away from the noise. Thomas, is that your son? My chest did something complicated. It is. I had no idea. He's never mentioned you. I mean, Reyes isn't the most unusual name, but something about the way he talked about his father tonight made me ask directly. And, Thomas, he described you as retired, doesn't say much about your work, kind of an old-fashioned guy who wouldn't fit in at a corporate event like this. I said, wait, what was your father's name again, and what did he do before he retired? I didn't say anything for a moment. Thomas Reyes, Richard continued. Aerospace propulsion engineer, 34 years at Holloway Dynamics. That's you. That's actually you. I worked under you for 6 years, Thomas. You taught me half of what I know about running an engineering division. And your son is standing 40 feet from me right now telling people his father is some quiet retired guy who wouldn't understand the room. I sat very still at my kitchen table, phone against my ear, feeling something I couldn't immediately name. Not quite vindication, not quite grief, something adjacent to both. He didn't invite me tonight, I said finally. Told me I wouldn't know anybody here. There was a long pause on Richard's end. Thomas, I have to go finish this event, but I'm calling you back tomorrow. This isn't something I'm going to let sit. He hung up before I could tell him not to make a fuss. Some things, apparently, were already past the point where I got to decide how much fuss got made. Richard called back Saturday morning, and this time he didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told Eric last night, after you and I talked, that I knew his father, Richard said. I told him you trained me. I told him some of the guidance system work you did in the 90s is still, to this day, taught as a case study in 2 university aerospace programs I know of personally. I watched his face do something I don't think I've ever seen a man's face do in real time. Realize he'd been embarrassed of the wrong thing his whole life. Richard, you didn't need to. Thomas, I'm not calling to apologize on his behalf. I'm calling because I think you should know what he said after that, because I think it matters more than anything I said to him. Richard's voice had gone quieter, more serious. He said, he never told me any of that. And I said, son, did you ever ask? I sat with that question for a long moment after we hung up, because it was, in its way, the same question that seemed to travel down through every family I'd ever heard a version of this story about. Did you ever ask? As if half the distance between fathers and children in this world could be measured in questions nobody bothered posing. Eric called me that afternoon. His voice, when I answered, sounded different than it had in years. Uncertain, almost young again. The way it used to sound when he called from college needing something he didn't quite know how to ask for directly. Dad, Richard Palmer told me some things last night. I heard. You worked with him. You trained him. He said you basically built the reputation this company's engineering division still runs on. I worked with a lot of good engineers over 34 years, I said. Richard was one of the better ones. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I thought about that question carefully before answering, because I wanted to give him an honest answer rather than an easy one. I told you plenty of it, Eric. Over the years. You were a teenager when I was running that division, and you never asked much about my work back then, and somewhere along the way, Not talking about it just became the pattern. And if I'm honest with myself, I stopped bringing it up because I didn't want you to think I was trying to compete with your own accomplishments or insert myself into rooms where you hadn't invited me. Like last night's party. Like last night's party, I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. I told people you wouldn't understand the room. I actually said that. To Richard Palmer's face, apparently, before I knew who he used to work for. I know. He told me. Dad, I'm sorry. I don't even know where that came from. I think, he stopped, started again. I think somewhere along the way I started thinking of you as just my dad. Not as a person who had an entire career and an entire life before I existed. I stopped being curious about you. That admission landed harder than I expected, mostly because it was more honest than I'd anticipated from him. Eric had never been a particularly reflective man, in my experience, quick to move past discomfort rather than sit in it. And hearing him actually sit in it, even for a moment, told me something had genuinely shifted. Can I ask you something? He said. Why didn't you push back? When I told you the party would be boring, that you wouldn't know anybody, why didn't you just tell me you knew Richard? I considered the question for a long moment, because it deserved a real answer, not a comfortable one. Partly pride, I said. I didn't want to have to announce my own relevance to get invited to my son's party. I wanted you to want me there because I'm your father, not because I happen to know somebody important in the room. And partly, Eric, I think I'd just gotten used to being quietly excluded, in small ways, over the past few years, and I'd stopped expecting anything different, so I stopped fighting it. That's on me, he said quietly. The excluding part. Catherine likes things a certain way, but I'm the one who kept going along with it instead of saying something. I know. I let you become someone I didn't have to explain to people. That's an awful thing to realize about yourself. I didn't disagree with him, because he wasn't wrong, and I've learned over the years that the kindest thing you can sometimes do for someone in the middle of an honest reckoning is simply let them have it, rather than rushing in to soften it before they've fully felt the weight. What do we do now? He asked. I don't know that there's a single thing to do, I said. I think you start asking questions you should have been asking for years. I think you tell Catherine that your father's coming to the next event, not as an afterthought, but because he's actually part of your life. And I think, going forward, we both do a little better at not letting distance become the default just because nobody's actively fighting to close it. He was quiet for a moment. Richard wants to have dinner with both of us next week. Says he has stories about you I apparently need to hear. He tends to exaggerate, I said, though I felt something warm at the idea of it anyway. I don't think he's exaggerating, Dad. I looked up some of your old patent filings last night after he told me. There's a guidance stabilization system with your name on it that's still being used, in some modified form, on aircraft flying right now. I had no idea. Actual, real, no idea. You never asked. I know, he said, and this time there was no defensiveness in it at all, just plain acknowledgement. I'm asking now. The dinner with Richard happened the following week, at a quiet steakhouse downtown, and for 3 hours I watched my son listen. Really listen. The way I hadn't seen him listen to me in years, while Richard told stories about a young engineer named Thomas Reyes who used to stay past midnight running stress calculations by hand because he didn't trust the early computer models enough to sign off on a design without checking the math himself. Eric asked questions. Real questions, the kind that require actually being curious about the answer rather than waiting for your turn to talk. Afterward, in the parking lot, Eric hugged me, which he hadn't done spontaneously in longer than I could easily remember. I've got a project team event in 3 weeks, he said. It's not glamorous. Mostly internal, some junior engineers, a few clients. I want you there. Not because of Richard. Because I want people to actually meet my father, not the quiet retired guy I've apparently been describing for years. I'd like that, I said, and I meant it in a way that went deeper than the words themselves. It's been 4 months since that party I wasn't invited to. Eric calls more now, not just to check a box, but with actual questions about my old work, about Holloway dynamics, about what it was like to be a young engineer in an industry that didn't yet trust computers to do the math a man's careful hand could do just as reliably. He's invited me to 3 more work events since, introduced me each time as my father, Thomas Reyes. He trained half the senior engineers your CEO still respects, which is more generous phrasing than I'd have used myself, but I've stopped correcting him downward. Some pride, held for the right reasons, is worth letting stand. Catherine and I are still working out our own version of this, slower, more careful. The way relationships between people who've never quite understood each other tend to require more patience than the ones built on old affection. She invited me to Thanksgiving this year without Eric having to ask her to. I noticed that. I think it mattered more than she realized it would. I still don't lead with my resume in rooms I walk into. That part of me, my father's part, the part that believes a life well-built speaks for itself eventually, hasn't changed and probably never will. But I've learned something in these 4 months that I hadn't fully understood before. That quiet dignity, the kind my father practiced his whole life without complaint, works fine as a way of carrying yourself. It works considerably less well as a substitute for actually being seen by the people who are supposed to love you. And it was never actually my job to make that trade on my own, alone, at a kitchen table, while a party happened without me 20 minutes away. If you've ever found yourself quietly excluded from the rooms where the people you love are becoming who they're going to be, I hope you find your way back in before you need someone else's phone call to make the case for you. And if this story reminded you of a father or a mother who's been carrying dignity a little too quietly for a little too long, tell them what they mean to you. Some people are still waiting to hear that nobody's had to remind you to say it.